this deportation to Siberia. This is something that when I was growing up, you got the general impression from your high school textbooks that all these kulaks were killed. Well, that's not the case. They were taken out to a place where they could make some contribution if they wanted to. Now, they really didn't have much choice. If they wanted to survive, they pretty well had to start all over again. Faced with the fact that they could not go back to the home country, home area for 5 years, and even if they did go back, they couldn't be farmers. Most of them never did come back, but their children, in the meantime, are educated along Soviet lines, and when they can come back to the big cities, they want to come back to the big cities, and something has to be done to accommodate them. But for the moment, the Soviet government has set off for 5 years the problem of its major class enemy on the land. That is, they have simply removed it. Molotov says that the middle peasants will snap to attention when they see how the poor farmers have gotten rid of the rich farmers and that the government has backed them up. And that's pretty much what happened. I think one of the things that amazed everybody was how successfully the land was transferred in ownership from the handful of people that had it before. Well, actually, a large number of people, if you take all of the land of the middle peasants, into the hands of the government. Because, in effect, the government owns all the land now that it has collective farms and cooperatives. And from that time forward, the Soviet government never has a financial problem. And this is something that Western historians, even to this day, if you listen to people like Fox News, will say, oh, Stalin destroyed Soviet agriculture and never recovered. Not even to this day, they'll say things like that. Well, if your idea of Russian agriculture is that a few people got dispossessed, well then yeah, of course that did get destroyed. But the important thing is that the Soviet government now owns all of the arable land in the Soviet Union. Well, that's a tremendous wealth. So that the farmers have been transformed from being an embarrassing albatross around the neck of the government into being its most important economic asset next to the working class itself. In other words, a true farmer-worker alliance has been created. Now, that is the long-term consequence of what happened in the beginning of 1928 and was completed by the end of 1933. Now let's go back to take a look at what this meant for the Army. I think I mentioned that in January 1929, Stalin tells the Red Army in a conference with them that, now you guys have got to get fully on board with this collectivization. What's he mean? He means we're going to use the Army to enforce collectivization wherever the Cheka is insufficient. Now by this time, the Cheka has several 100,000 men in uniform. The secret police, in other words, have now got a uniform corps. But what are these? These are the most dedicated Bolsheviks of the whole bunch. And but even they are insufficient to enforce collectivization across the entire Soviet Union. So he knows the Army is going to be required to come in and back them up, and he's making it clear to the Army that your budgetary future depends upon the success of this program, because the money we're going to get from the ownership of all of this land is going to be going largely into your pocket. So the Army is, if they didn't understand it before, they certainly understand in January 1929 that their future is tied to collectivization. Now, was it really? Yes, it really was. And that's one of the points I think that you want to pull out of that book, Rifle and Hammer and Rifle by Mr. Stone, published, as I say, 14 years ago, year 2000. Was originally his doctoral dissertation, but it's the most important recent document to explain to you the kind of crisis that the Soviet government was confronting. Now, on its western frontiers, what it had was a Baldwin-led coalition which wants to put Germany in the spearhead of a new war against the Soviet Union. And they have been doing everything they possibly could in the late 1920s to bring that about. But Baldwin keeps running into obstacles. The first obstacle he ran into was when the Soviet government signed the Rapallo Treaty with Germany, which made Germany into a de facto ally of the Soviet government. Not to mention the fact that it became a capitalist government that actually recognized the Soviet government, became the first one to do so. Well, that was bad enough as far as they were concerned, but it wasn't something that they thought was insurmountable, that they couldn't get over, and they had been doing all kinds of things, which you'll read about in your textbook, to try and prepare a new front against the Soviet government. Well, of course, the Russian army was well aware of this. Chika was keeping the political bureau informed about all of these developments, and the government too. So Baldwin's plan still is to form a London, Berlin, Rome axis. But the next big problem he has is that Hitler comes to power in Germany, and that is not something that the British ruling class was happy about. The Baldwin group was not happy about that, and they represented the majority of the British capitalists, because to them, Hitler is just another Cromwell, another extremely dangerous adventure. They know Cromwell almost destroyed them completely. I mean, he abolished the monarchy, he abolished the House of Lords when he created the English Republic, and as long as he was alive, there was nothing anybody could do about it, because his command of the New Model Army was complete, and that army could not be defeated. And as many times as the Royalists had tried to defeat it, they had been unable to do so. As far as they were concerned, Hitler's just another Cromwell, except that he's not British, but he's another poor white trash bum out there running Germany that we don't want to have running our affairs. So the Baldwin group did not easily accept Hitler would not accept Hitler as a leader of this coalition that they had in mind to attack the Soviet Union. They changed their mind at the end of 1936 when fascism was doing so badly in Spain that they decided they would accept Hitler after all. That's another story. But what I want to get to here is that the Soviet government faced a very real threat on its western frontiers. General Tukhachevsky, as we mentioned before, had a theory which was preventive war. And it was based on the idea that we can't win a protracted war as things stand right now. For one thing, we don't have enough military forces on a regular basis to defeat the 3-odd million men that the frontline countries backed by England and France can send against us. And it will take us too long to mobilize the vast reserves we have and to get them up to speed. Rykov, who's head of the government, who replaced Lenin as head of the government when Lenin had his stroke, now says, I didn't realize things were that bad. Okay, we'll set up a commission to investigate this and see what money the Red Army should get on an urgency basis, if any, and see if Tukhachevsky is really telling us the truth or if this is just another excuse to get more money. The Rykov Commission comes back and it says things are bad. We have the 600,000 man army we have right now in 1924 is not nearly big enough to do the job, and it's not fully equipped. So it needs to be urgently brought up to speed. That means an additional allocation. And in addition, we have these other plans for expanding military industry. But Sokolnikov, who's head of the Finance Commissariat, says, well, listen, you guys are talking pie in the sky here. You're not going to get the money you want to do all of these things. You're going to get a maximum of 600 million rubles, period. You decide how to break it up. Well, that isn't going to do the job. So what we have confronting the Soviet Union in the latter half of the 1920s is a situation where no matter what it does with its existing budget, it isn't going to have enough money to satisfy the needs to both get the army as it is up to speed, let alone increase its size, and to build for long term. In other words, they need tanks and planes, modern armaments of all kinds, and they don't have the money to build these factories. So where are you going to get the money? The answer is collectivization. Once you own all the agricultural land in the Soviet Union, then you will have the money to do both of these things. This is what becomes apparent to the party in 1929, because Stalin makes it clear to them. And in 3 different meetings in 1928, they get prepared for all of this. In the beginning of 1928, the reason we have 3 Central Committee meetings called that year is that many things were happening internally and externally to the Soviet Union that required intensive analysis and agreement agreement was very important among some of the Central Committee members about what needed to be done about it. As a consequence, in Chapter 15, I have printed Stalin's entire speech to one of these Congresses, well, I think the most important one. The only time I did that in your textbook, so that you can see the details of what they were confronted with internally as well as externally. Now, the China policy, as I mentioned briefly, had collapsed, and in the next lecture we're going to talk about that policy, so I won't spend more time on it right now, except to say that it had been collapsed completely in April of 1927, so by the beginning of 1928, all of that had sunk into the Central Committee, as far as the fact that they no longer have a buffer that Lenin had hoped to build on the eastern side of the Soviet Union. So it's not just the West that we're concerned about. It's a very strong possibility that the Japanese may attack from the east, possibly the United States too. So that's something that has to be taken into consideration. Another thing which is happening, which is extremely important, is that the Chicas has managed to get its hands on a tremendous amount of industrial equipment. Now, at the end of Chapter 13 in your book, you'll see a meeting between Stalin and the Chicas that he has given the task of getting all of this foreign technology by hook or by crook. Since they won't sell it, since they won't license it, we're going to have to steal it. That's the essence of that policy. And he sets up a program to see that that happens. And now we have huge amounts of advanced industrial equipment being brought into the Soviet Union from Western Europe by hook and by crook, and lots of technical knowledge that's being, in fact boatloads of it are being shipped to the Soviet Union from this massive spy organization that Chika has established in Western Europe. So too much of that equipment is arriving and having no place to go. So that's another problem. In other words, the infrastructural basis for the insertion of all of this modern equipment from the West is not being completed on time. So that's another serious problem, because in one of these meetings in 1928, he tells the party, look, we're confronted with a situation where we have hundreds of millions of rubles worth of equipment sitting out in the rain, or soon will be in the rain and the snow, and being covered with tarps, and that isn't going to do the job. The only way to preserve this equipment is to get it inserted into the industrial plant it's supposed to be in, and to get it working. So some way has to be found to get that infrastructure completed and brought up to speed. And at the same time, it's facing the scissors crisis in agriculture itself. What is that? Well, on the one blade of these scissors is the ability of the kulak, new kulak class, to withhold the produce until they feel they're getting the right prices for it. And they're starting to do that. So the other part of the scissors crisis is that the government is supposed to supply industrial goods to the countryside in exchange for the agricultural produce. But that's not happening either, because the government doesn't have the industrial capability to supply the things that it should be supplied to the countryside through no fault of its own. It's just the industrial basis in the cities is producing enough for the cities, but it's not producing enough for more than drips and drabs of it to get into the countryside. So you have the government caught between the demand of the mass of the people that live in the countryside for industrial products, and the inability of the government to supply that on the one hand, against the demand of the kulaks, who are capable of withholding large amounts of grain from the market, and thus they think to affect the price that the government will eventually pay them. Now, this doesn't actually come to pass, because when collectivization starts at the end of August and early September of 1928, the kulaks as a group are removed. They're put on trains, sent out to Siberia, and they're out there to start all over again, as we mentioned before. For periods of 5 years, they cannot come back. And when they do come back, they can't ever get involved in agriculture again, because they can't they're not allowed to be members of cooperatives or collective farms, which is now the only legal form of agriculture in the country. So there's no future for them back where they came from in Ukraine or Georgia or Belarus or wherever it was, or Russia proper. Most of them just stay out in Siberia or Kazakhstan, wherever it was that they built their new farm. Their children, on the other hand, are now old enough that they can come into the cities if they want to, and they can participate in the educational opportunities that are available there. Go to college, learn a trade or a profession, and join the economy like anybody else. But it's a problem either way that the Bolsheviks have set off for 5 years. And in the meantime, they forced that collectivization through, so that by the end of 1933, there is no land in the Soviet Union that isn't owned by the government, either as a cooperative or as a collective farm. And that means that you have no more financial problems. The Army will, from that time forward, have all the money it needs to modernize fully. Well, is that going to be enough time? Well, just barely. We know the war starts in June of 1941, so Stalin's able to delay the war that long, but it's just barely long enough to get things moving. That is, to get up to a minimum amount of industrial preparation. So those 3 meetings begin in April. There's another one in July 1928, which, as I say, is the meeting where I pre-produced Stalin's entire speech. He talks about the international situation, the major contradictions in the world between the imperialist countries and socialism, and finally he gets down to talking about the questions of socialist construction in the USSR, talking about the details of the grain procurement policy and why they're going to have to do what they begin to do in August and September. Now, that actually goes along about as well as one could expect. The big shift in this whole period of time is that for the first time, the Army is now going to have everything that it needs to get up to speed right now and to prepare for the inevitable World War, which means industrialization. You've got to have the industrial plants to build the tanks, the industrial plants to build the airplanes, and so on, that will be necessary to fight this war. We're going to talk about that in great detail as these lectures proceed, but the most important thing, I think, to get out of all of this is that the pace that Stalin set was something that very few people really understood, I think, even in the Central Committee when it started out, because my guess is that their general impression was that this collectivization was going to proceed at a somewhat slower pace, but instead it happened almost overnight. So that in the first 6 months you have the entire Kulak class removed from the countryside. And as Molotov said, this will make the middle peasants snap to attention. If they don't, in other words, if they don't want to get removed from the countryside right along with their richer brethren, then they better join the collective farms right now. And furthermore, what the government has decided, after having done many experiments across the country in the 1920s, is that the system that works best is to take everything that each of these farmers has and put it into the collective farm. So middle farmers have got the biggest choice to make, because they have to be willing to accept becoming de facto employees of a collective farm rather than owning their own land. But on the other hand, the advantage is that they have a guaranteed salary every month. They're going to get paid. They're always going to have something to eat, so on and so forth. So these are the advantages of having a job as opposed to being a private capitalist entrepreneurial farmer. And this they eventually sell to the middle farmers, or if they don't sell it to them, they force them into these factories one way or the other, these collective farms one way or the other. And that, of course, is why the participation of the Army in 1929, along with the Cheka, becomes important in enforcing this reorganization of the countryside. So in July 1928, Stalin finally says in that Central Committee meeting, that the NEP, the new economic policy, will no longer suffice. That the time is at hand, they have no choice anymore because of the reversal of their China policy, because of the fact that machinery is piling up everywhere in the country without a place to put it, and that the only way to save that machinery, which has been so hard to get their hands on to begin with, is to get it inserted into the new equipment. The only way to do this is to collectivize agriculture and get the money that's necessary to do all the things that you have to do. And so the Central Committee agrees with all of those things, and now they go back after it. Well, all right, who were these kulak farmers that you have to get rid of? Well, didn't we get rid of them already once? Yes. In 1917, 1918, that class of kulaks, which the Tsar created, and these were the richest farmers, and they were used to control the rest of the farmers in any given village or region, and they were liquidated as a class during the Civil War of 1918, and peasants rose up and they seized their land, the land of the church, the land of the former Tsarist officials themselves, and Tsarist nobility, and that was the end of them. But in the years that passed after 1918, the farmers that had come out of all of this began to divide up. Some became rich, some were in the middle, some had small amounts of land, some didn't get anything at all in the land grab affair that had been the redistribution in 1918. And so a new class structure had arisen among the peasants among themselves, and the wealthiest ones were given the name kulak again by the party. Kulak is a Russian word for fist, and now the fist is going to meet the Chika, which is what happened in 1928. Chikas arrived in these villages in force, and as the poor farmers and their agricultural workers revolted and seized the land and farms of these rich farmers, the Chika backed it up, and these people were deported, as I say, and then of course they were gone for good for practical purposes, although technically they were only exiled for 5 years. Okay, so agriculture has changed completely. The Soviet government is now fully in command of the entire country. Politically, it's fully in command because all of these collective farmers are under party leadership. There are no more private farmers anywhere. The agriculture is now a state enterprise, so everything that comes off of the land is owned by the government. I'm just going to, there's so much of the detail in this textbook is well worth your reading, but now let's go over here to, in 1929-1930, Stalin decides to take over the military and industrial planning as well as agriculture. So within a year of the collectivization, he's decided that in order to solve the problem of industry, inserting all of this equipment that the Chika has purchased and getting our infrastructure up to plan, we are going to have, we meaning the political bureau, is going to have to take over the planning of industry and the army itself. And to do that, he's going to have a new government. So in 1930, Rykov is replaced by Molotov, who is more up to speed with what's going on than Rykov, who was a great man for his period of time, but he served his purpose. Okay, so we have in 1930 a new government taking command, and Molotov's first task is to get this industrial situation squared away, get the infrastructure up to speed, and get all of this equipment inserted into the that the Chika has purchased abroad, and all of this information, boatloads full of information that's been shipped to the Soviet Union, in the hands of the right technical specialists, so they can start building the right kinds of plans. And to do this, Molotov calls upon some of the people that have already emerged as troubleshooters in the time that this first 5-year plan, which kicked off at the beginning of September of 1928. Some of these people that have been proven to be very good at what they do. One is Sergo Ordzhonikidze. He's a man who had been the Red Army general that had been in charge of the liberation of Georgia. and he had been involved in with Maxim Litvinov, who was chief bank robber for Krasn at one time, and I think Valerian Kubashev, another boss from the 1920s who had a good track record of getting problems resolved. If you want to see some of the details of this, you might read Molotov's autobiography called Molotov Remembers, which is an important source of information about what was really happening in those days. Remember, we've said you're already going to throw away all the garbage by the 3 R's, Robert Service, Robert Payne, Robert Conrad, stuff that's just total lies from beginning to end and should go immediately to the trash can. So what you want to do is start going to accurate sources. Molotov Remembers, obviously an important one because he was the head of government during these years. Now, what you found by the end of 1930 was that this Molotov government had accomplished a great deal. It had, for one thing, it had gotten its hands on tanks from both England and the United States. In the U.S., a man named Christie had invented a way of independently suspending the wheels on tanks, and a similar thing had happened in England. So the Cheka was able to get their hands on all of this. In England, they'd had to steal it. In the United States, they were able to buy it from Mr. Christie because nobody was paying attention to him here. He was on the verge of bankruptcy, and the Pentagon wasn't paying any attention to him. So or what passed for it, the Pentagon, the U.S. Army wasn't paying any attention to him. We'll put it that way. So he sold his tank designs to the Russians for cash, and they saved him from bankruptcy. And they shipped his prototypes to Odessa on marked as agricultural equipment and some kind of end-user collective farm over there. But at any rate, Stalin had sent them to get this advanced tank, the designs and equipment, so that they could copy them in the Soviet Union. Voroshilov talks about that. He says, Comrade Stalin sent us, he said, I don't care what it costs, I don't care how long, but get fast, get everything you can about the most advanced tanks in the world. Whatever it costs, we'll pay for it. So they got that over there, and they started building tank factories so that by 1933 the Russians had the most advanced tanks in the world. Same thing, similar sort of thing was happening in aircraft, and Spanish Civil War turned out to be a very good testing ground for both Soviet tanks and Soviet aircraft. I go over all of that in your textbook in the appropriate chapter, but I'm just going over this quickly now so that you can see that the money is available and it's being spent. But to do that, Stalin realizes that he himself and his closest colleagues have to take over industry the same way they took over agriculture. So by the end of 1930, that is accomplished, and miracles in terms of military production are happening. But of course, as usual, Western countries are uninformed of this because their intelligence organizations have been broken up. Now, one other critical problem has been resolved here. The problem that was emerging between the old bourgeois specialists and the new Bolshevik specialists within the Russian economy before 1929 are gone, because all of a sudden there's more jobs than can possibly be fulfilled by all of these men put together, and there's a labor shortage. In fact, they're having to call, the Comintern is actually calling for foreign engineers and specialists to volunteer, to communists that is, to volunteer and come and join and help build the Soviet economy. They're not doing that just because they think it would be a good idea to do it for political reasons, which it is, but they're doing it because they actually need these guys. There's a real labor shortage. Everywhere you turn, dams are being built. Hydroelectric plants, as a consequence, are coming online. Industrial production of electricity is going to triple in the 4 years from 1928 to 1933. Every kind of industry that you can think of, from machine tools to actual assembly of cars and trucks, tanks and planes, all of that is suddenly coming into existence. Why? Well, because the Stalin-Molotov government has the money it needs for the first time to buy everything it needs when it needs it. And even Henry Ford, as anti-Bolshevik as he is quite willing to sell to the Russians if they're going to pay him gold up front, so he can get his profit as well as everything else. Right now, Ford is too much of a businessman to say no to that. So he goes right along with it. If you see pictures, photographs of the first Russian cars and trucks, you'll say, "Boy, those look like Model T Fords." That's because they are Model T Fords. And same thing with the trucks and so on. These are exact Henry Ford factories which were imported over there, inserted into the economy, because now the electricity is there, the buildings are there to stick them into, and so on. The infrastructure's been prepared. Everything is being done. So what we have here with collectivization is a great turning point. It's not, they call it the Great Turn, not just because of the socio-cultural nature of the fact that the farming class of people, which is 90% of the country, has been changed. You proletarianized the entire mass of them, because effectively they're now all on a payroll. But you've turned them into a vast economic asset in two ways. First of all, the government owns all the land, so it determines the price it's going to pay the collective farms for whatever they produce. So in other words, taking the commodity of wheat, the government is determining the price that it will pay for wheat. It's also determining the price that the consumers are going to pay for bread on the retail end. So this is a true command economy, a true socialist planned economy. You contrast that in 1929 with the collapse of the global capitalist system, and you can see that for people around the world, intelligent, educated people, like the Philby group in England, for example, a group of spies, they look at what's happened in their own country and in the capitalist world. They look at what Stalin's doing in the Soviet Union, where they don't have any of these problems. In fact, they have full employment. Everybody that wants a job has got a job, and even if you don't want a job, you've got a job. And to them, it seems like there's no choice at all. It's obvious which way you want to go. So this has tremendous political implications at home and abroad that are very good for the Soviet government in every sense of the word. Naturally, the capitalist press doesn't like this, and they try to make as many lies as they can, just like they are now. I've never seen the pack of lies that Washington puts out now about the Ukraine. They control ABC, NBC, CBS, PBS, Fox, NPR, all the rest of that. And they put out this total lie about what's going on in the Ukraine, even though it's harder to get away with it because there are alternative sources of information, which even if Americans don't get RT as much as they might because they're not used to it, Europe does. And the Europeans have a completely different interest in this whole thing. So it's getting harder for the capitalist press to fool as many people as they used to be able to fool. But even in those days when they could fool lots of people, intelligent, educated people weren't fooled. So you have people like Kim Philby, Donald McLean, Guy Burgess, and the rest of the Cambridge Five, for example, who decided to throw in their lot with the Soviet Union. And in their case, they found the best way for them to move forward was as spies for the Cheka. Another story that I don't want to get off into, except to conclude with the bourgeois specialists and the old Bolshevik specialists no longer have a contradiction within the Russian economy because there's more jobs than anybody can fill, so there's plenty of space for everybody. This allows the old Bolshevik specialists to kind of die off, and the old bourgeois specialists to kind of die off, and the new Bolshevik specialists to naturally grow into position, and their children will go to school, and of course they'll become bureaucrats too. Bureaucrat in the sense that they'll become technical people, they'll become engineers and scientists, and they'll have jobs to play in the industrial part of the evolving Soviet economy. So lots of problems have been solved, but let me just take show you a couple of examples of the kinds of problems that Russian communists were running into as they tried to build their industrial plant. Well, in the book I use two examples, the Nizhny Novgorod auto truck plant, which I often just abbreviate as NN, and the other auto truck plant at Magnetic Mountain. Now, NN was also renamed as the city of Gorky, but it was an old Russian city that had a long tradition of existence under the Tsarist regime, and then had an old and well-established Bolshevik cadre in it when the decision was made to build the first $30 million Henry Ford auto production plant there. So that's what they had to start with. Now, there were several planning agencies that the Soviet government had created. One was called VATO, which was the all-union, that is the Federal Automobile and Tractor Manufacturing Association. Another was called Vysenka, National Economic Council. Still another was called STO. In your book, we'll go through the details of these, but I'm kind of hesitant to throw out too much of these initials and names in this lecture, because I don't want to get you confused, and if you're interested you can read these details because they're all in your textbook. Now, one of the problems at Nizhny Novgorod turned out to be right away that the reports they were getting in Moscow turned out to be inaccurate. Things were not happening the way they were supposed to be happening there. Now, this came to the attention of the political bureau, not through the way it should have come to their attention, through their own organization, but through the press. Now, they had a very active press that did a lot of muckraking. And one of the newspapers there was called For Industrialization, and it had a correspondent named Boris Agapov. And Boris went down here to Nizhny Novgorod, or Gorky, and began investigating firsthand what was going on. And he found out that it was a disgrace, that the two contracting organizations were at war with each other. In their first meeting that he attended, they spent the entire meeting screaming at each other and calling each other names, and it turns out that one of them had put the orders for the other one on the back burner because they weren't getting the things they wanted. And fortunately make this long story short, troubleshooters emerged. The Politburo sent Sergei Orzanikits and another man to straighten things out, and they did. But it required the intervention of the center to get all of this mess cleaned up down there. Now, Agapov was probably their guiding light, because everything he recommended is what they eventually did. And they replaced one of these subcontractors altogether with the other one, and then they did the things that they were best at. Now, tackling the mechanical bottlenecks of this was one thing. The other thing the Bolsheviks could throw at it was their ability to mobilize the spiritual nature of the cause. In other words, they could go to the workers and convince them that this is in your hands. If you want this government to succeed and you want industrialization to work, then you're going to have to set the pace. And they were really good at that. So with their propaganda machine in full blast, with workers being presented to the entire country everywhere as heroes, they were able to get these guys to take command and help them solve technical bottlenecks. So between these two things, Kaganovich and Orzanikits were able to get that mess at NN squared away. Well, what about Magnetic Mountain? Well, Magnetic Mountain presented another set of problems altogether to the government, because this was an area that had nothing in it prior to the time that the party decided to turn it into an industrial city. What it had was a mountain that Stalin had climbed when he was a kid, which was called Magnetic Mountain, and it was one of those things that everybody in Russia knew about, because if you went there and you had a compass would go crazy, because the mountain was almost solidly made of iron. So that's why it was called Magnetic Mountain, and the city was called Magnitogorsk. Now, in Russia, I mean. So the party wanted to have a place where they could start from scratch and build what would be an ideal Bolshevik city in terms of what their idea of what Bolshevism, what a complete socialist society should look like if everything they had was going their way. Well, they couldn't do that in Nizhny Novgorod, which came with it an inherited Tsarist tradition and all of the bullshit that goes along with it. But they figured that in Magnetic Mountain, they could start from scratch. And what they did was exactly that. There's a book written about it called Magnetic Mountain, Stalinism as a Civilization. It was published in 1995 at the University of California Press in Berkeley, Los Angeles. Started out as a doctoral dissertation of a man named Stephen Korkin, K-O-R-K-I-N. At any rate, it's a very interesting book because what he's done is to show this is what Bolshevism under Stalin wanted to do. This is what their vision of the future was like. And this is very important because Stalin's entire life he had adopted the idea of duplication by other countries of what was going on within the Soviet Union. Professor Antonio Gilman explained this to me many years ago, and I've followed it up since then, found it out to be exactly correct. Stalin had a cookie-cutter idea about what socialism worldwide was going to look like. They'd build it in Russia, and then they would like the other countries to do exactly the same thing. Now, Bolshevik parties around the world, that is, communist parties around the world, they bought into this idea too because they needed something to sell to their own people, which was, we'll get rid of this system, which you know how lousy that is, and we'll create what the Russians have. We'll do exactly what they've done. In other words, this is a duplication thesis. Now, the problem with that thesis, which Stalin himself realized and in the 1920s mentions in several of his speeches, is that he says other countries are looking to us as the model for what they should do. The problem with that is that that model keeps changing. In other words, our model of what we're doing keeps changing. And he says this even before collectivization. So after collectivization, you can imagine how much that model has changed. So in his mind, in the mind of the entire Bolshevik Central Committee, what's happening at Magnitogorsk, at Magnetic Mountain, which, by the way, is on the other side of the Ural Mountains at the very border, at the very end of the Soviet border. And after that, you go into Central Asia. But so it's in a really good position from the standpoint of security. What is not in a good position is there's nothing there. So everything that you want, you're going to have to import. The only thing you've got there is the iron, but to smelt it, you're going to have to bring in coal on the river, and of course, then to make something out of that iron, you're going to have to build all of the industrial complex, which they do. They set up another one of these Ford tractor factories, and turns into a tank factory and car factories, and pretty soon Magnitogorsk has every kind of industrial plant within it that you can imagine. By pretty soon, I mean during the course of the 1930s. So at any rate, that's the second area that's constructed that is important for you to take a look at. Nizhny Novgorod shows you what happens when you take an existing city and try to build a socialist plant within it. Magnitogorsk shows you what you have when you start a virgin territory where you've got nothing and you start from scratch. The other nice part about Magnitogorsk for them was in terms of their schools and their cultural programs and the way they indoctrinate youth and train people, they could all do exactly what they wanted to do. So you have all kinds of advanced arts and crafts and culture going on out there at the same time. Now, during this period of industrialization, in February 1931, Stalin addresses a meeting of all of the technical managers. And by this time, of course, we've had all of 1929, all of 1930. So we're over halfway through the first 5-year plan. And he says, we are 50 or 100 years behind the advanced countries. We must make good this lag in 10 years. Either we do it or they crush us. Now that's taken from the 4th of February speech in 1931 Stalin gave to his industrial managers. Now this is not hyperbole. This is exactly the way he sees the situation. So what they what he wants to do is to build that entire essential industrial plant that they have to have within 10 years. Now, as an aside, and you'll read in other parts of this book, he's telling a few people that, including Feldman, or Alexander Orlov, who he's going to send to the United States, Victor Sorga, who he's sending to Japan, he's telling a few of these people that even with all of this, assuming that we do everything we have to do at home to build our tank factories and plane factories and so on, we still cannot win a world war against all the capitalist countries against us. What we're going to have to do is look toward some kind of alliance with some of them against the others. Well, he figures that that alliance in the long run has a good possibility of happening with the Americans. And for that reason, he sends Alexander Orlov to the United States to get into position to make some kind of contact with FDR. He's sending Sorga to Japan to keep him closely advised as to what the Japanese are planning to do with regard to attacking them again on their eastern frontiers, now that they don't have the China buffer anymore, or even the hope of the China buffer. Never actually had it, but it didn't actually materialize. So his primary hope to win the coming war is based on what they do themselves within Russia. And he's telling his managers, you have 10 years to get us what we need, an industrial plant, and catch up with where the capitalists are today, and they're 50 or 100 years ahead of us, depending on which country you're looking at, or they're going to crush us. So this is the way the war against the kulaks is developed by that time. They're gone. And so from 1929, what we've got is getting the Russian army modernized with the money that's now coming in from agriculture. Now, what we're starting out with, as you'll recall, was an army in 1918 of 300,000 men. By the time that we get to 1929, this army has increased to about 600,000. Well, actually, it's been reduced to about 600,000. But in 1929, they begin to get all of the things that they need to bring those 600,000 men up to speed. At the same time, we've had all of this money coming in from agriculture. We have a situation in oil where something has to be done there too. Now, what was that? Well, we're going to get to that in just a minute. But the most important thing at this particular point in January of 1930 is that the T28 tank, which is the first Russian tank I mentioned that comes out of these things that the Cheka managed to get from England and the United States, is by now the best tank in the world. That's not saying a hell of a lot, but it's because the only other good tanks in the world were Germany, but then they weren't that good. But at any rate, the next real question confronting the government in 1930 was the crisis in the oil field. Now, as soon as the first 5-year plan got underway, the reports coming back from the Caucasus about Baku and Batum, about the oil production there, turned out by January of 1929 to have been largely false. In other words, managers were doing down there what oil field managers often do, and that is to lie and to send up, including today, and send up false information about what's actually in the ground and what they're actually looking at. Now, in 1929, Stalin made a ruling. Remember that Stalin knew more about oil than any other political bureau member because he'd started his career out in the oil field and had been a protege of Lenin Krasin, who was himself an oil man. So there wasn't any trick in the oil field that Stalin didn't know. And he realized that when you're dealing with this bunch of animals that you're dealing with out there in the oil field, you've got to have a very firm hand. Believe me, it's still the same way today. I know after having spent some years in the oil field myself, from Louisiana to Mexico, Louisiana, Texas, Mexico, that this is a whole world unto itself. But at any rate, Stalin knew what he was confronted there. Now, so in 1929, he told these oil field managers, any further falsification of figures, any more casing and dry wells, and you guys are going to be shot. And so the managers got panicky over this. They started a strong protest that went all its way up to Stalin, and the essence of it was, if we're going to be confronted with that kind of an incentive program, then you should at least get us the best equipment that we can have, so that we don't make mistakes and case dry holes and so on. And what they wanted specifically was for the Schlumberger brothers to be brought from France to Russia with all of their well logging equipment. What is that? Well, this is an entirely new thing. It was just invented that year, 1928, actually. The Schlumberger brothers were electrical engineers who had, in the first couple decades of the 20th century, they had traveled to oil fields in different parts of the world, like Texas, and Pennsylvania, Indiana, China, Russia, Venezuela, Mexico. Wherever there was oil, they had traveled there, and they would lay a line across the surface and try and predict where oil might be. Electrical line I'm talking about. Well, that had mixed results. It wasn't very successful. What changed everything for them was when they decided to run the open end of a cable, an electric cable, down an oil well, down a hole, and then pull it out at a given speed, say 14 feet per minute, which is the speed I used to log at frequently. And then one end of that cable would touch the wall as it went, and the other end of that cable was grounded at the surface. Changes in the resistivity, or conversely changes in the conductivity that the wire registered as it was pulled out of the hole, would tell you whether you had what kind of sedimentary rock you had. Now, all sedimentary rock is what we're interested in, limestone, shale, or sandstone, because that's the only place you're going to have oil. You won't have oil in the middle of an igneous rock or a metamorphic rock. So what we're looking for are sedimentary rocks. We know pretty much how they register electrically on this kind of this is called an electric log. Anyway, this has just been developed, and they'd had mixed results with that too, but they had gotten their best results in Baku, which, as you know, was part of the Soviet Union. So now these engineers saying, well, if we're going to be shot for casing dry wells, wouldn't it be better to first of all get this equipment over here so we would know for sure whether a well should be cased? What does casing a well mean? Well, when you drill an open hole, all you've got is dirt, sediment, and so on, piled on top of each other for a couple of miles deep, and then it's full of water. There are various ways that you could guess as to whether you have oil or not. One, of course, would be whether it comes out. Even if it does come out on the top, then you have to know whether it's sufficient. This is a lot of guesswork involved here. I'm skipping over all of that. The advantage to the Schlumberger system would be to tell you which specific sediments you should be looking at to produce oil and how much oil is likely to be in it. And that way you're much less likely to case a hole that shouldn't be cased. And in other words, much likely to get shot. So Stalin agreed that this would be a good idea, and he signed an agreement with the Schlumberger brothers to bring their factory from Paris to Russia and all of their technicians. In fact, the family of the Schlumberger brothers moved along with their husbands and fathers to Russia, and for the next, almost 10 years, they built the Soviet oilfield service industry, which made it the most advanced oilfield industry in the world. We go over that in the textbook and you can read about it. Interestingly, it also made the Schlumberger family the wealthiest family in France because they got paid in gold. And I guess that speaks for itself. So in that way, the situation in oil was brought under control. At the same time, the situation in industry was being brought under control. At the same time, the situation in agriculture was being brought under control. All of these two things were tied together. Again, the secret to all of this was money. Because without the money from agriculture, you would never have gotten the Schlumberger brothers and their equipment and so on over there. So, again, we have it. Voroshilov said in 1932, the Politburo, and mainly Comrade Stalin, demanded from us, take all measures, spend the money, even large amounts of money, run people to all corners of Europe and America, but get models, plans, bring in people, do everything possible and impossible in order to set up tank production here. So, by 1939, they had accomplished miracles in this direction. They had 6 varieties of battle tanks, which meant that they could engage in all 3 varieties of armored warfare. And I go through the details of those ever. But these were by far the best tanks ever produced for the war. In fact, by 1933, the Soviets had the best tanks in the world, and they kept having the best tanks in the world all through World War II. Everybody agrees that the T-34 was the best tank of the entire Second World War, and this thing was produced in tens of thousands by these Soviet factories. But the timing on this is critical. You'll see that when the Nazis attacked Germany to begin with, in June 1941, that there were only a handful of these T-34s that had come off of the production lines. Stalin had hoped to delay this war another year, because if he had been able to delay it one more year, he would have had 10,000 of these T-34s, and that in itself could have stopped the Nazi attack. But Hitler knew a little bit about the Russian preparations, and he was also confronted with a problem back home among the capitalists that had supported him, and that is he had promised to do away with Bolshevism, and if he was going to back off on that, he was going to lose that critical capitalist support back in Germany that he had to have in order to maintain his regime. So he was under pressure from both ends, and he decided to roll the dice and go for broke. That was a mistake, as we all know, but he made it. At any rate, my point here is that what Stalin had set in motion in these years of the 1930s was of critical importance to the survival of the Soviet Union in the end. And these are some of the major problems that the Soviet Party confronted and had to resolve. You'll read all about most of that in Chapter 15, and then we'll pick up World War II in Chapter 16. In the next lecture, I'm going to go on and talk about Bolshevism spreads to China. And then that is really important, because while it failed in its first time around, it succeeded the second time around. And we'll see exactly how that goes. But our concern is going to be with the first part of it. So I'm going to conclude this lecture right there, and we'll go on to Bolshevism spreads to China in lecture number 7. Assuming this is going to be 6B.